All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon from the UK mission. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're delighted to have you for our Presidency press conference. You all know this far better than I do, so I'd be grateful if you could just let me know by raising your hands if you want to ask the Ambassador a question. I know some of your names, not all of them, so please forgive me if I just have to point to you. And if you're dialing in by WebEx, please let me know if you can, if you want a question, either by raising your hand on the screen or telling one of your journalist colleagues that I've forgotten about you, so I don't leave you out. We'll start with some opening remarks from the Ambassador, and then we'll go into Q&A. We'll hope to get round to all of your questions and make sure that anything you want to know about our presidency, we can provide the information to help you have a really productive month here at the UN. So, Ambassador, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mungo, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I know it's the day before the 4th of July, so it's very good to see you, and thanks for your support for our work and the UN's work. As you all know, this month, July, the UK assumes the presidency of the Security Council. We always try to run efficient and open presidencies, and talking to you and working with you as you do your important work is a priority for me and my team. Let me start by outlining 3 framing remarks or priorities for the month before I take your questions. The first is I'd like to set this in the context of the speech in multilateralism that my Foreign Minister gave last week. And in that speech, he announced the UK's ambition to drive forward reform of the multilateral system. And our presidency in July marks the first step in that process. The key point, I think, to emphasise is that the UK and the Foreign Secretary in particular has listened very carefully to what our friends and partners around the world have been telling us. We've heard and we recognise that other countries' concerns that powerful countries are neglecting their responsibilities. And we want to be an agent of progress to change that. Let's remember, however, that multilateralism has worked well for the last 80 years. It's underpinned a 40-fold increase in trade since 1950. It's delivered global vaccines for infectious diseases and, thus far, prevented another world war, with fewer deaths in violent conflict since its founding than any comparable period. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. And it doesn't mean it will automatically survive for the next 80 years without reform. So our position is, as my Foreign Secretary said, let's reform that we may preserve. The 5 priorities that my Foreign Secretary laid out for that are Security Council reform, reform of the international financial systems, trade, international tax and debt, and technology. Let me unpack just a couple of those. On the first, reform of the UN Security Council. We want to see expansion of the Council's permanent seats to include India, Brazil, Germany and Japan and African representation. It's high time the Council entered the 2020s. On the second, on technology, that brings me into also the question of the Security Council addressing threats to international peace and security in the future as well as today. So on technology, during our presidency, we'll be bringing artificial intelligence to the Security Council for the very first time with our signature event this month. Many of you will know that as humanity stands on the precipice of this gigantic technological leap forward, we want to encourage a multilateral approach to managing both the huge opportunities and the risks that artificial intelligence holds for all of us, including its implications for international peace and security. As my Prime Minister has said, no one country can do this alone. This is going to take a global effort. So the UK's Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, will chair a meeting of the Security Council on the 18th of July with briefings from international AI experts and from the Secretary-General. And that brings me on to my third point, which is using the Security Council this month to address the pressing issues of peace and security today. We do have a packed agenda, and I won't list everything, but let me just draw out a few highlights. First, it won't surprise you, on Ukraine. On the 17th of July, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly will chair the Council's regular briefing on Ukraine as Russia's illegal invasion enters its 17th month. We've said it several times in the Council, but Russia's invasion is clearly also a calculated assault on the UN Charter and the values and principles it stands for. Russia's invasion poses the most immediate threat to what the UN stands for, an international order where disagreements are settled peacefully with diplomacy, not death and destruction, where might does not equal right. So we'll use our presidency to ensure the truth is heard about Russia's war crimes and once again urge Russia to end the war so Ukraine can return to peace and start to rebuild. And let me be clear here. The UK wants peace. Ukraine wants peace. We support all efforts by our friends and partners around the world towards peace. But the only one with the power to end the war tomorrow is President Putin. And until then, we will proudly and rightly support Ukraine to defend itself against Russia's unprovoked invasion. Many of you have seen that in the past 17 months, Russia has sought to abuse its position on the Council to legitimise the war and disrupt Council activity as a distraction. So as President of the Council, we will consult closely with Council members to ensure the Council's time is used productively. A second pressing issue of today, of course, is conflict-related sexual violence. And this will be the subject of our second signature event, ministerial level open debate. We've talked a lot about it, and you know that sexual violence has been recognised as an international war crime for over 100 years. Yet we've seen this appalling crime repeatedly in recent conflicts, including in Myanmar, in Syria, in the DRC, and now in Ukraine by Russian forces. So the debate that we will host will focus on the need for better implementation of Security Council resolutions to prevent this from happening. It will be chaired by the UK's Special Envoy for Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, Lord Ahmed, and member states will hear from a Myanmar women human rights defender and conflict-related sexual violence survivor. And we'll take this approach throughout the month, inviting members of civil society to brief the Council every week in the spirit of transparency, democracy and openness, including on children in armed conflict, post-conflict reconstruction in Colombia, and the conflicts in Haiti and Syria. And we hope that the powerful testimonies of those for whom these crises are a daily reality will inspire cooperation and conviction across the Council. The third pressing issue that we will talk about indeed this Friday is the question of cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria. As some of you know, last month I went to visit the border myself. I saw the overwhelming level of humanitarian need, and that is, of course, since the earthquake in February, it has intensified, and the last resolution on this was in January in the Council. And I heard from the UN, I heard from civil society, I heard from local government. All of them had the same message. They need predictable, long-term access across this border crossing to deliver humanitarian aid. I think the Council has a duty to do the right thing, to open more border crossings for longer periods of time. And to be frank, if it were up to us alone, this would mean at least 3 border crossings for at least 12 months. And I think the important thing to remember here is this is not and should not be a political bargaining chip. This is simply about humanitarian aid access and aid access alone. So that will be the debate that we have on Friday. We will also this week look at the latest report on children in armed conflict, which came from Virginia Gamba's office. Very important annual debate in the Council, and most of you will have noticed for the first time that the Russians are listed as a country of concern in this report alongside terrorist organisations such as Al-Shabaab. The first time a permanent member of the Security Council has been so listed for children, abusing children in armed conflict. Finally, we have been following events in Jenin over the weekend very closely, of course. We will want to respond to any requests from Council members for further discussion on this, and indeed on any other subject. So I won't cover that just now, but just to let you know that it is on the radar in case any Council member requests a discussion. There's a lot of other events and discussions in our programme, and we can come to those, I think, in our Q&A. But as you can see, it's going to be a busy month, and I'm now very happy to take any questions from you that will help you understand our planning better. Thank you very much. Back to you, Monk.
Thank you, Ambassador. And so the first question goes to Valeria.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ambassador, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association for this press conference. We wish you the best of luck for the month ahead. Valeria Robeco from ANSA News Agency. My question is on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Things doesn't look like very promising, so how confident or how hopeful you are that in the end a consensus can be reached for an extension of the deal? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you for the work that you do. Yes, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, of course, expires on the 18th of July, so that will be just a day after we have our debate on Ukraine. The initiative has clearly been incredibly important in terms of getting grain to countries that need it, to people that need it. And more than 50% of the grain of course, has gone to middle and developing middle income and developing countries. More importantly, the Black Sea Grain Initiative has held the price of grain down from the peak it reached in March 2022. And we very much want to see it continue for those reasons. But at the moment, I think it's being held hostage, frankly, by the Russians on the grounds of an ammonia pipeline deal and so on. But the key point, I think, is that every time we come to these points of renewal with the grain initiative, Russia plays brinkmanship. It's playing brinkmanship with the food on people's tables around the world. And when they threaten not to renew the initiative, the price of grain spikes, which has an immediate impact. And the other thing they do, of course, is slow roll the inspection of ships going through. So we're now down from just over 4 million metric tons of grain being cleared a month to around 1.2 million metric tons of grain a month. So already we're seeing the Russians playing brinkmanship with grain on people's tables. I'm not confident about renewal. I don't know how this is factoring into Russia's calculations, but I know that the UN is doing all it can. We will do all we can. We've already worked very closely with the City of London to enable a very complex payment system for grain in order to make it work and continue to get food on people's tables. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdul Hamid.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi that is based in London. You just mentioned Jenin. Jenin has been now subject to a major aggression by Israel. 10 Palestinians were killed, 50 were wounded, buildings were attacked, a hospital was also attacked. So your country's position keep talking about the two-state solution and the right of Israel to defend itself. So do you believe the choice or the option of a two-state solution is still viable, possible, attainable, for real? And the second, if Israel has the right to defend itself as one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, not only in the Middle East, does this right apply to the Palestinians as people under occupation? Do they have the right to resist occupation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. And we've been following the events in Jenin over the weekend. And the first thing to say is that I want to express my condolences to those who've been killed. And I don't think we have a final tally. And send my best wishes to those who have been injured in the fighting. I think to your key question, yes, we still believe that a two-state solution is the best way forward for the two countries to live together based on the 1967 guidelines. But it is right, as you say, every country has a right to self-defence, but that right has to be exercised in line with international law and international humanitarian law, and that's the most important principle here to underline.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll go to Edie next.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. A follow-up first on your artificial intelligence meeting. Could you give us some more details and background on how the UK sees the two sides of this issue, who the speakers might be, and the summit that we know that the UK is planning sometime in the fall? My question is about Haiti. What is the Security Council going to do, especially in light of the Secretary General's just concluded visit and his statement that immediate help is needed? Is the Security Council going to consider a new resolution? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Edie, for those two questions. So we're very excited about the first ever Security Council discussion of AI. And I think it won't surprise you to know that when you think about the possible benefits, you look at the way in which AI could support in development, it could support in humanitarian aid, it could support in peacekeeping, it could support, in conflict prevention when you look at the way in which it can collect and analyse data. So there's enormous potential there. It could potentially help us close the gap between developing countries and developed countries. If you think, in development alone, the UN produces about 6,000 pages of documentation. If you're a small mission here in New York, having AI to help you sift through that could actually help you pinpoint on the key things that are relevant for you and take a view. So there is enormous potential for AI, and I know some missions are already playing with it and experimenting with it and benefiting from it. So the benefit side is huge. But there's a risk side too, and it doesn't take too much to imagine, for example, what would happen if AI was unregulated in autonomous weapons, for example, or what would happen if AI was put in control of nuclear weapons. So those are the sort of security questions that I think we need to look at, but we don't want to throw away the benefits just because of the risk. So we want to have a pretty wide-ranging discussion. We're in the process of tying down the speakers that we will have, but as I say, my Foreign Secretary will lead the discussion, and what we hope is that this will be the trigger for more discussions, and then we'll take those through to the summit in the UK, and I don't have a date for that just yet. We're working on that. It's a very fast-moving situation, this whole AI thing, but it's a subject of great interest to my Prime Minister. I saw my Foreign Secretary when I was back in London. We talked about it then as well. But I think the point is that it speaks to the heart of what my Foreign Secretary said last week, that this is something that we cannot do alone. This has to be a global solution, and that's why we want to bring it to the Security Council, bring it to the UN, and then have a convening session in London where we'll be able to have a truly global multilateral discussion about it. On Haiti, yes, I mean, it's now more than 2 years since President Moise was assassinated, and there's been no, of course, investigation of that. And since then, the gang violence in Haiti has intensified, and we followed the Secretary-General's visit there very closely. He's gone on, I think, to the CARICOM meeting, and we very much welcome the work that's been going on in CARICOM, and we will have a session on Haiti during our presidency to discuss developments there and whether it's possible for a way to tackle the gang violence. The Secretary-General, I know, has called for a sort of security support for Haiti, and that would be a possible way forward. So I don't know what will come out of our meeting, but we do have a meeting scheduled in our presidency. Thanks.
Go to Michelle next.
Thanks, Ambassador. Just a couple of follow-ups, really. First of all, on the Ukraine grain deal, Russia is now offering free grain for Africa and other countries that are developing countries. What are you hearing from those developing countries who are the ones who were hurt the most last time round with the rising prices, which this deal obviously helped tamp them down a little bit? What are you hearing from them? Do they want to? Are they telling you that they want the deal to continue? Are you encouraging them to tell Russia that? Just whatever you're hearing on that. And then on Haiti, last year the US was saying that they would do a resolution on an international force once the international force had been established. But it sounds like the Secretary-General now, after his visit, is saying it should be the other way around, and that should be a resolution first, and then hopefully, I guess, a force comes second. What do you think about that?
Thanks. So on Russian grain, to be honest, I'm a bit sceptical, and I'm sceptical for two reasons. What we've seen with Russian exports of grain and fertilizer, the ones that go out of Novorossiysk, is that it's easiest for large countries to do this because we're seeing increasingly a state-to-state contract model, an old Soviet trading model, effectively. And small countries in Africa, particularly small developing countries, find this monopoly impossible to break into because they either need smaller amounts of grain or they need smaller amounts of ammonia to mix with to make fertilizer. So this, I don't take that promise at face value at all, I'm afraid. This is just old state-to-state trading trying to evade the market, so that doesn't help at all. And I would put that in the context of the wider point about Russian humanitarian aid. And Russia's humanitarian donation to the whole of the UN last year was $10 million US dollars. And we all heard President Putin say that he was bankrolling Wagner to the tune of $2 billion last year. So Russia's humanitarian aid doesn't stack up. Thanks. Oh, sorry, on Haiti, yes. So what we are doing in our council session, which will be on, now I've got the programme out, I can tell you, 6th, is we're negotiating a renewal of the mandate for the UN force in Haiti. And I've heard this inversion question about which comes first, the mandate or the force, or the force or the mandate. The point is, we need to get a mandate that can be delivered. So I don't think it matters. We need to know that we can actually deliver the mandate. There's no point setting out a line in the sand. So I think we will want to look at what the renewal can cover, but that's a very live negotiation, and that comes up on the 13th of July.
So are you suggesting that in the renewal of BNU, there could be a line about an international force rather than a separate resolution just on an international force? Because I got the impression that's what the US was suggesting last year.
Yes, I think that might have been what they were suggesting last year, but another way around it would be, as we renew the mandate, to look at adjusting it to take account of the situation and what's feasible. Yeah, but it's a live negotiation, so haven't got there yet.
We'll go to Nada and then James.
Thank you, Ambassador. Two very quick questions. First, on the AI debate, the Secretary General had kind of thrown out this idea of having a regulatory body like the IAEA. Do you think something like that, given how fast-paced AI changes, how powerful it's becoming, would be good rather than a framework? And then you had mentioned that Janine is on the radar in case any country requests a meeting. Have you heard any kind of whispers about a country wanting to put that on the agenda in the coming days?
Yeah. Thank you. So I think, we're all looking for the most effective way to regulate AI and to allow it to flourish. And you put your finger on the problem exactly, that it is probably the most fast-moving thing we've ever tried to look at. So we can't cookie cutter, as it were, previous regulatory mechanisms. You think about the MPT or something with nuclear technology. So I think it's worth looking at the way in which the UN and other international bodies have regulated different things in the past. There may be things we can draw from, but I don't think that we've got, even in the IAEA, a mechanism that we can cookie cutter onto AI. I think it's much more likely that we'll want to go back to principles and try and find a way of regulating something in a sort of forward-looking way. But the IAEA, one, has done a fantastic job. Two, does the sort of protection of the intellectual property piece, as it were. And three, has some very clear principles. So it's useful to have in the mix, but I don't think it's the, I don't want to say magic bullet, but you know what I mean, solution to that. And I've now forgotten your second question. Oh, is Janine yes. So this is the sort of the first working day of our presidency, and I think we were all following the events over the weekend. And a couple of counterparts said to me at our opening working breakfast that this was something they were concerned about. So I think it's very likely that we'll end up scheduling a meeting into the programme, but nothing formal yet. Thanks.
We have James, and then just to say, I can see you on the screen, Iftikhar, so you're on the list. But James next.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. Staying on the same subject. And Israel's military actions. Two related questions. Children in Armed Conflict report, you were saying Russia was on the list, but the other news was Israel wasn't on the list, even though the Secretary General had warned Israel, if you go on killing children, you'll be on the list, and then somehow he left them off yet again. What is the UK's reaction to that? And on Janine, we've seen today 15 drone attacks on a heavily populated refugee camp. In the UK's view, is this proportionate? In other words, is it legal under international humanitarian law?
Thank you. And I think I could say that bilaterally, from the UK's point of view, we were disappointed not to see Israel listed in the CAAC report. We've been very concerned about the attacks on children. But the CAAC report is, of course, written by Virginia Gamba's team and approved personally by the Secretary General. And I would say they do have very strict criteria. So the fact that Russia was on the list for those 480 attacks on schools and hospitals is important. We were disappointed, but we do remain concerned about Israel not being included, and more importantly about Israel's attacks and the impact they have on children. In terms of Janine, as I said, we do want the IDF, the Israeli Defence Force, to demonstrate restraint in this operation in particular. And we do see an urgent need for all parties to avoid further escalation in the West Bank. We do, as I said earlier, support Israel's right to self-defence and condemn the recent terrorist attacks unequivocally, but want to see the protection of civilians in all cases. And we do want to see Israel acting in accordance with international humanitarian law and call on them to adhere to those principles. But it's too early, I think, for me to make a judgment about what's happened. Sorry.
Thank you. We'll go to Celia next.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Hello?
Iftikhar, go next, and then Celia, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Iftikhar.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Ambassador, congratulations. Wish you success in the month of July. My name is Iftikhar Ali from Associated Press of Pakistan. Your support for the expansion of United Nations Security Council as part of its reform by 4 more veto-wielding members runs counter to the case made by uniting for consensus group against any expansion in the permanent category because it would make it more unworkable. As you know, Ambassador, UFC advocates more elected members with longer terms, make it more democratic, representative, and accountable. Don't you see any merit in the UNFC list?
Thank you very much for that question. You've put your finger on something that I know has been a very live debate during the IGN this year. But as I say, the UK's position on UN Security Council reform has been, I would say, out in the front for a long time now. We've been very clear that we support permanent membership for India, for Brazil, for Germany and Japan, and African permanent membership. So we welcome the debate carrying on, but I think the most important thing is to bring the Council into the 2020s and make some progress on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Celia.
Thank you, Ambassador. Celia Davaren, Africa Confidential. I would like to go back to the Security Council reform and to know how many seats do you think could go to Africa, and will they get like right of veto or not? And also I would like to know what UK thought about the withdrawal of the MINUSMA. Do you think it was too early, or what do you think about that? And did you agree with it?
Thank you for those questions. So as I said, we set out our position on Security Council reform some years ago because we could see even then that the Council was not geographically representative and not representative of the world today or 20 years ago. So we've said very clearly we want to see African representation, and it's really for the Africans to decide who should take that seat. So we're sort of waiting on further developments on that one. I think the whole question of what happens with the veto is, I know is a very important one. You'll know that the UK hasn't used its veto since 1989. We're part of the ACT agreement that we wouldn't do that. So in particular with respect to humanitarian situations. So that's again an open question, but
I was there. Breakfast.
Can someone mute? Sorry, Ambassador.
no, that's right. I haven't got an answer for you on that, but we remain very committed to bringing the Security Council into the 2020s and making it effective. On MINUSMA, really, I think it's no secret that we were very disappointed by the Mali authorities' decision, by the decision itself, but also by the timing. For Foreign Minister Diop to announce that so peremptorily. I think it was quite a relief that we agreed that the MINUSMA forces would aim to leave with the objective of by the end of the year, because this is a very complex operation to draw down indeed. So that was an important development. But I think two things follow from that. The first is that leaves security in Mali in the hands of Wagner. And you don't need me to tell you that where Wagner is, we see chaos, we see human rights abuses, we see violations of international law. So that's a major concern for the people of Mali who depend on this peacekeeping operation. And more importantly, Wagner is in Bamako, and that's not where the people of Mali most need protection from terrorism and crime in order to go about their lives. So there's a huge unresolved question now about who will support and protect the people of Mali. And I think it's very important that we continue discussions with the regional groups as well in order to try and work out a way forward. But it was a premature and rather hasty decision in our view, and we've tried to do the best for peacekeeping forces who've done very well indeed, and the people of Mali. Thanks.
We'll go to Ephraim and then Desi.
Thank you so much. Ephraim Kosaifi, Arab News Daily. The war in Sudan, as we're speaking, the fighting has picked up again. Thousands died, thousands injured, millions displaced. I wonder if there are any concerns within the Security Council about this issue. Were there any requests for emergency meetings? I see only the regular meeting. That's one. On the Security Council reforms as well, can you just say a word or two on why did you decide to have Japan, Brazil, India, and Germany out of all countries as permanent members? And since the Security Council is filled with Arab issues as well, from Libya, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, all of them, Iraq, do you support a permanent seat for an Arab country, for example? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's start on Sudan, which is a situation that has been preoccupying us now since the fighting broke out in April. Sorry. So I think a couple of things to say. We've had a number of meetings, some of them in close consultations, to discuss the situation. And you'll see that just last week we were able to agree a press statement reflecting our views. The situation, of course, remains of great concern. These sort of short ceasefires, which barely hold, despite the efforts of the United States and Saudi Arabia, have been, I think, of grave concern. And as you say, people are being killed and millions are displaced, and that creates other pressures across borders. So there's a lot for us to remain concerned about. I think the key thing now is to try and give our support and to accelerate the regional processes, but it's something that will remain on our watch list and our horizon scanning. And again, if we see a need for, or if we receive requests from other council members, we won't hesitate to call for a meeting. So we'll keep watching that. We will actually have a Security Council meeting this month on the 13th of July, but that's of course the one that looks at the referral of Darfur to the Council. And to be honest, many of us have been reflecting that since that referral in 2005, the last thing that we want to see is a repeat of what we saw then. So we're very mindful that we don't want to see history repeat itself on that. On Security Council reform, I think our thinking behind the 4 countries that we supported was partly to do with geographical balance. So introducing India and Brazil would bring a wider geographical representation into the Council, but also to bring in countries that have more influence than they had when the original Security Council was put together in 1945 for obvious reasons. So there's a sort of combination of recognising the world as it is today alongside geographical balance, and that's behind our position too on Africa, but we didn't make a prescription on which African countries. That was left up to them to decide. So that's the thinking behind that. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, the Arab. I think we sort of drew a line at the 4 plus the African representation that we had, and that could, of course, include an Arab African country. So it's not ruled out at all, but we didn't make a specific provision for that. Yeah. Do you want to?
Desi and Toshi.
Sorry.
Hi, Ambassador Dejushi with China Central Television. 2 questions, but first, wish you a successful presidency.
Thank you.
First, I remember last time when UK was the president, a Russian delegation actually complained because I remember they requested a meeting, but got turned up because of technical issues, I think. So just now you actually mentioned that you want to be more productive for the Security Council. How are you planning to do that? And second, in the capacity of the UK, I think earlier this year in March, Argentinian government mentioned that they want to resume talk on the issue of Falklands Islands, the Isla Malvinas. Any possibility to resume dialogues with the Argentinian government? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So in terms of productivity, part of that is making sure that the Council agenda first of all, fulfills the mandate. So some of the things on the agenda, as you see, are things that come up. So the children in armed conflict debate, we're mandated to hold the Iran debate. It comes up as part of a sequence. So we need to handle all of those. And then we want to make sure that the Council discusses the pressing issues of the day. And so that's why we've picked both Ukraine and conflict-related sexual violence and artificial intelligence. So where we've got discretion, we're focusing our agenda. It's also about how we conduct our council meetings. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that our briefers are genuinely expert and can add value and input for the council. And we also want to include the voices of civil society, and we will, in line with our commitment to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, make sure that an equal balance of those briefers come are men and women. So we'll do that. We also want council discussions to be sort of interactive where they can. And at breakfast this morning, I said to my counterparts that we would very much welcome short, concise statements focused on actions. I live in hope. Not ones that simply admire a problem or are full of disinformation. So that is how we will attempt to be productive. And we will, of course, I think we have 4 mandate renewals coming up during our presidency. So Syria, we've already mentioned, CAR, Haiti, and I've forgotten the 4th one, but we'll come back to it. So we'll make sure that those are done in a timely way. So that's an attempt to be productive. In terms of the Russian Federation, I can't actually recall the meeting that you are referring to, but the Russians did say at the end of our presidency last year that it had been the worst ever Security Council presidency in history. And I have to say that is a badge I wear with some pride. We are scrupulously objective and professional in our handling of Security Council business. We have the wonderful support from SCAD all the time, so we are continuously observing the rules and regulations and working within the framework to be fair and objective. That said, we are not interested in bringing disinformation and lies to the Council, and we will continue to rebut that. And in terms of the Falklands, I agree, an important question, but it's a bilateral issue between the UK and Argentina, so not on the agenda. Thank you.
Toshi next, and then Evelyn.
Thank you, Ambassador. Toshi Inaba from Kyoto News, Japanese Newswire. I have a follow-up on the withdrawal of MINUSMA, and I'd like to know how much it could affect other peacekeeping operations and other peacekeeping forces, because it's set a precedent of expulsion of the peacekeeping forces. And as you know, from time to time, some peacekeeping operations are unpopular on the ground. How much are you worried with a possible sort of domino effect on peacekeeping forces? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think it's a very valid question. And behind it is really the question of how UN peacekeeping forces can keep a peace when there isn't a peace to keep. Because when we mandate peacekeeping forces, it is normally to support peace and to support the government as it builds that peace for its people. And we saw that run through our fingers in MINUSMA, sadly. So I think you raise a very real risk. And let me sort of highlight 2 trends. The first one, to be honest, is we see increasingly this breakdown of relationship between UN peacekeepers and the authorities concerned, often where we see the Wagner mercenaries, the Russian Wagner mercenaries, present in countries. And I think that's a very worrying relationship because, as I said earlier, where Wagner mercenaries go, we see chaos, we see violations of human rights, and we see violations of international law and very little peace. To be honest, we just see mining and extraction of commodities away from the hands of the people who own them and should be profiting from them. So there's that worry. And I think you're right, too. There is a sort of domino effect worry. And there's a bigger question there about the sort of Western Sahara and parts of Africa where countries' boundaries are very fluid, particularly when there is herders or there's a past there. So I think one of the important things we'll do during our presidency will be the debate on Western Sahara, West Africa and Sahara, and looking at the sort of cross-regional situation there, and also the important role that regional peacekeeping forces can play as well. So I think they'll have a very big role, and it's been very interesting listening to some of the arguments about how they can be deployed and developed into these situations. Thank you.
We'll go to Evelyn next, and then Yoshita, and then we'll come to this side of the room.
Thank you. You mentioned Wagner, and Minister Lavrov has gone out of his way to assure countries in the Sahel that despite what happened in the Ukraine or the attempted coup, Wagner will still be around, and their favorite is the CAR. where they seem to be extremely active. Anybody moving against them, I know that they mine things and they steal diamonds, and a little friendly rape doesn't help. But Russia keeps assuring African countries that they're not going to stop this.
So, sorry, the question was...
The question is, have you been following them? How dangerous are they still, despite their Ukraine debacle?
So I agree with your premise about Wagner in Africa, and I do think we see Wagner in slightly different roles in different parts of Africa. So I take your point, for example, about CAR. It's not the same type of Wagner operation as it is in Mali or in some other places. So I think that is worth saying. It's not a complete cookie cutter. And I know that Foreign Minister Lavrov has been touring extensively around Africa, shoring up support for Russia's position. And of course, the South African president led a delegation of African leaders to Kyiv and to Moscow to talk about the war in Ukraine. I really find it hard to say anything certain about any truth at all in what Foreign Minister Lavrov said, or in fact what we hear coming out of the Wagner Group. It's very inconsistent and I think all very murky. So the bottom line is it's not something on which I would place my own security. Thanks.
Yoshita.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yoshita Singh with Press Trust of India. I have a question on the UN Security Council reform. When the IGN was rolled over for the next session, India termed it as a wasted opportunity and said the process could go on for another 75 years without any solid outcome. The member states have been discussing the process without a negotiating text. What concrete steps can we expect or do you think should be done to ensure that there is some forward movement to see on the ground? Otherwise, like as India said, the process will go on forever. Thanks.
So thank you for that question. And I recognise that it has been a very frustrating process. As I said, we set out our position more than a decade ago, trying to lean into the question, broaden the representation, bring the Security Council up to date. And, I've had good contacts with the IGN co-facilitators this year, and I know that they've tried very hard indeed, but there is such a wide range of views that it seems very difficult indeed to make progress. So I recognise the frustrations. We too thought it would be useful actually to move to text-based negotiations, but I'm afraid there wasn't enough support for that to make immediate progress. But it's something that we do, as I say, continue to support because we need to see the Security Council come into the 2020s. Thank you.
Take a question here, and then Shiho, and then the gentleman in front.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. My question is regarding Iran. There are reports that the UK is expected to announce plans to breach the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The decision comes just a few months before the expiration of Security Council resolution on Iran nuclear deal. In your national capacity, is your government at all worried about the reaction that the Islamic Republic of Iran may have? As we know, they are very close to acquiring a nuclear bomb. Do you think that is going to make the situation worse? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we share your concern. Iran now has, we think, about 3 times the minimum amount of highly enriched uranium that is needed to manufacture a nuclear device. So the stockpiles are high, and Iran's ability to enrich uranium is also very high. So that's a situation that is causing us a lot of concern, and it's why we're working so closely with our E3 partners in particular on the question of what to do next about that. We'll have a discussion in the Council on the 6th of July on Iran, looking at Security Council Resolution 2231. Iran is in flagrant breach of that, not least also the way in which it's selling UAVs to Russia for the war in Ukraine. So there's quite a lot of concern there, and we'll have a chance to discuss it on the 6th of July. Thank you.
Shiho.
Thank you. Shiho Matsuoka from Japan's Nippon Television. For the Ukraine meeting on 17th, are there any other foreign ministers that are invited or confirmed to attend, including Secretary Blinken or Foreign Minister Lavrov? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I know my foreign minister will very much look forward to seeing his counterparts at that meeting. They will have just come from the NATO summit. Some of the foreign ministers have already attended, but we don't have a final list yet. But I will say here, I very much doubt that Foreign Minister Lavrov will come.
I'm Louis from Indo-Asian News Service. Are you taking up anything in terms of Afghanistan, where you have a crisis and the UN staff not being allowed to work?
Thank you for that question. Yes, a crisis that I agree, the UN staff can't work, but neither can the women of Afghanistan, more or less. So the crisis is enormous, and it's not just a working crisis. As you know, it's a humanitarian crisis as well, with more than half the population of Afghanistan in need of humanitarian aid, which the UN is finding really difficult to get to those people because women aren't allowed to be part of the distribution. So there is a huge crisis in Afghanistan. We very much welcome the Secretary-General's convening of special envoys in Doha last month, which I think was a good way of finding some sort of way forward, and I know that they plan to meet again. I saw the Special Representative Rosa Otunbayeva just a couple of weeks ago, and it was good to have a conversation with her and hear her experience on the ground of what she's seeing, both in Kabul, but also some of the things she's hearing from the rural areas. So it remains an issue that is of grave concern to us. We talked about it in the Council last month under the UAE presidency. The next formal meeting is scheduled for September, but if we have requests, then we'll clearly move to try and include something more urgently if necessary, and if we can make a difference. Thank you.
Please, yes.
Thank you, Madam President. Martin Wang from Xinhua. Again, about AI. So I still want to know more about the rationale behind including AI as one of the 3 signature events. So in the context of international peace and security, how outstanding this issue is. Just now you expressed your concern about nuclear. Can you give me more examples? Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thank you. So the rationale is that the Security Council is, of course, responsible for international peace and security. And we don't know what AI could bring in this context. As I said earlier, it's clear that we could derive great benefit from AI in the UN's work in development, humanitarian, peacekeeping, data use, monitoring, and so on. But there have to be concerns, too, about how AI might be used, for example, in nuclear technology, whether any country with nuclear weapons would consider handing over the management of those weapons to AI and how that could go wrong, or the same with automated weapons as well. So I think there are areas of concern, but as we've been discussing, this is first of all very new technology, and second of all developing and evolving very fast indeed. That's one of its characteristics. So our aim was really to allow the Security Council to have briefing from experts, to hear from the Secretary-General, who's been thinking about this quite a lot, and to start a multilateral discussion on what the implications were and how best we should benefit from AI, but also manage its risks. And as the UK, we look forward to starting that off this month during our presidency, but also picking it up during the summit in London later this year as well. So we're very committed to acting as a convener and a constructive force in this debate as we move forward. But as I said, my Prime Minister says this is something that we can't do alone. It has to be a global solution, and that's why we're starting here at the UN. Thanks.
Sherwin, thanks very much for turning up. And a question for you.
I mean, I'm sorry for being late, Ambassador. Sherwin Bryce, South African Broadcasting. It begs the question, right? Is artificial intelligence a threat to international peace and security? Is that what you're saying?
So artificial intelligence is the sum of the data that's input into it. So artificial intelligence is not itself an actor. We are the ones who can deploy it, can direct it, can see its risks. So that's why we need to have a debate in the Security Council. That's why we need a summit in London, because artificial intelligence itself can't, in particular, do anything.
Right, but then why have a meeting in the UN Security Council which has a specific mandate if it's not a threat to international peace and security is the question.
Because we want to explore whether in some applications or in some evolutions, artificial intelligence could be a threat to international peace and security, and where it could be helpful. I mean, there is quite a good analogy here with nuclear, although I don't want to overdo it. Nuclear has a great deal of civil beneficial uses. It also can be turned into weapons which need to be regulated. So that's the sort of way forward we're trying to find with this extraordinary technology. The difference between the two is that, of course, nuclear technology was held, particularly when it was regulated, by a very small number of countries. AI is proliferating among the general population, and so there's a difference there, but the analogy, I think, holds a bit. Thanks.
I think we have time for a final question from Alan, please.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. Alan Bulgati from RIA Novosti News Agency. Yesterday, the Deputy Chairman of Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, published an article in which he says that it would be better to temporarily suspend the diplomatic relations between Russia and the UK, or at least to lower their level. What do you make of that, and are you ready for that?
So last month when I was back in London, I saw the British ambassador to Moscow, who is doing an extraordinary job in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and flagrant breach of the UN Charter. So I think it would be a pity to downgrade relations, because when the war comes, when Russia finally takes its boots off the grounds of Ukraine, it will be very important to rebuild the situation using diplomatic relations. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I think that's all we have time for. I hope we got through all of your questions. Look forward to working with you throughout the month. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with the team at the SECA. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you all.